Joining us today for the pundits is Kevin Richard of Idaho Education News, Stephen Feldstein of Boise State University, Christine Tiddens of Idaho Voices for Children, and Betsy Russell of the Idaho Press. Kevin, I wanted to start with you and kind of get an education update. Where are we at with the big issues like funding formula?
Well, we're in a holding pattern on funding formula. The House Education Committee discussed it a little bit this week. One member of the committee, Gary Marshall, a first-year lawmaker from Idaho Falls, said that he felt like he's been cut out of the loop and he really doesn't understand it. And that led to sort of an interesting back and forth where a few minutes later he confronted our reporter and said, "I'm not trying to subvert the process, and I don't want to." So I don't know what to make of that. He says he spoke mistakenly. May have been just a moment of extreme candor about an issue that's been unfolding the entire legislative session. More discussion on Monday, still no RS, so still no proposal formally introduced in the legislature yet.
Any idea when that formal proposal might be up?
No specific date that we've heard, and at this point, I mean, you've got legislative leadership obviously moving towards trying to adjourn here in the next few weeks. I mean, we may be 3 weeks out from the end of the session, and I don't know if this is an issue as important as it is to some legislators, that this is an issue legislative leadership is going to want to hang up the entire session over.
Another issue that the House considered this week was a vaccination information form that will be sent to parents, basically informing them of their rights to opt out of vaccines. And that ties in with the story that you released on Thursday.
Well, let's talk about the numbers first, and then we can kind of get back to where we're at on the legislative front. Department of Health and Welfare issued some new immunization numbers this week, and they're pretty surprising. They're pretty significant figures. The overall immunization rate dropped somewhat. We're at 86.5% of students are fully immunized. But where you've seen a big change in the numbers is in the number of students who are attending school without a full battery of immunizations because their parents have opted out of at least one immunization on the state's list. You now have 7.7% of kindergarten, first, and seventh grade students are in school under one of those exemptions. Put it another way, there are more kindergarten, first, and seventh grade students who are attending school on an exemption than there are kindergarten, first, and seventh grade students in the entire Boise School District or in all of charter schools across the state. It's a very significant number. It's not a small fraction of the population we're talking about.
And this is all happening during a measles outbreak in several states nationwide.
It's happening during an outbreak around the country, and it's also happening in the backdrop of a legislature that is really looking at proposals that may make it even easier for parents to opt out. A rule has already passed the legislature which will permanently allow parents to opt out simply by submitting a letter. Used to be you had to fill out a form, not a very long form, by the way, it was only a 2-page form. Now parents can simply write a letter. That rule was in effect this year, so it might have affected the numbers we just saw this week, but now it's a permanent rule the legislature has signed off. And as you alluded to, the House passed a bill on Monday that would require public schools, private schools, and private child care providers to give parents opt-out information at the same time they receive information about the state's immunization guidelines. Passed the House fairly handily, now it goes to the Senate.
But what's interesting about it passing the House fairly handily is it almost didn't make it out of committee. It was a relatively close vote at 7-5 in House Health and Welfare.
It was a very interesting committee meeting, and you're right, it was a 7-5 vote in the committee to pass it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you brought up the rights of parents, and I wanted to bring you in, Christine, on this. You work with Idaho Voices for Children.
Yes.
And as you look at so many of these issues that involve children, it seems that a lot of the topics on families really are centered around the parents more so than the actual children that the policies affect.
Yeah, I think especially in the Idaho legislature this year, that's what we're hearing a lot of coming out, especially out of the House, and a lot of these conversations. In our conversations with communities, when we reach out to individuals impacted, so the kids, the youth, the different organizations who work with these, that's not what we're hearing. And so this is why we're showing up and why we're here at the Capitol, is trying to make sure that our top priority is on children and from their perspective. Because when we let that slide and we forget that children are our top priority, that's when we can start to see some major harms coming to kids.
I think that we've heard some of that same theme in the debate over the sex education bill, which came out of committee in the House today on a party line vote after 2 days of hearings. Quite a bit of debate over that bill from Representative Barbara Ehart of Idaho Falls. And the representative who sponsored it said she just wanted it to be about consent, not content, not to change anything in the content of what's taught, but to make parents opt their children in to get sex ed in school rather than opt out as the current law requires. But at the same time, she's changing the definition of what sex education is to anything that relates to sexuality. And basically, educators and many other groups have come out against this bill saying this is going to mean that parents will have to opt kids in to large segments of required classes that are required for, say, high school graduation. They were saying everything from science to animal science, history, literature, many things could relate to sexuality. And so how far-reaching the change would be, it would require school districts to offer alternate educational activities to those kids during the time that they're not opted in. And of course, if parents don't respond at all, the kids aren't opted in. And so it's unclear exactly how that whole system would work. The bill now will go to the full House. It would have to pass the Senate and get the governor's signature to become law. But that parental rights theme is one we're hearing more and more, particularly in the Idaho House this session.
You know, and you bring up a good point, because as Representative Ehart was closing her testimony today on Friday morning, she brought up parental rights repeatedly. Meanwhile, a number of students, bringing the conversation back to children, a number of students testified earlier this week saying that they were in favor of a more comprehensive sex education.
Right, you had several students testify on Tuesday saying that they want this information to be made available to them and to their classmates, and a couple of them made the point of saying that if you have an opt-in requirement for sex education, you're putting some students in a really untenable position if they are the victims of abuse at the hands of a parent or a guardian, that it's impossible then for that child to get permission to take a sex education course.
And of course, that wasn't the only issue that involved children this week. What were some of the other issues that you were keeping an eye on, Christine?
So this was a big week. We had our Foster Care Awareness Day, where we brought a whole bunch of different individuals, organizations to the Capitol to start talking about the issue of foster care, child welfare, and outcomes. And as we're talking about parents' rights and are the voices of children actually being heard, we saw this play out in a really interesting and ironic way on Thursday. So there's a new Child Protection Legislative Oversight Committee. It's a committee that was created last year through some of our foster care reform package that we passed. It was Senate Bill 1341. And as the committee set their agenda, they prioritized inviting youth who have been impacted by foster care. So youth who have been in the foster care system to come and present and share their stories and engage in the conversation. And there were just amazing stories that came out of this. The committee room was packed, and there some of the honest conversations that were being had everybody in tears. The youth were being really honest and genuine about their experiences in foster care, including gaps in the system and opportunities that we can work together to improve the system. And the ironic part is, so it's a joint committee. Only the senators were present because the representatives, the members of the committee in the House, were upstairs on the floor debating a child welfare bill. And this child welfare bill is House Bill 170 that really focuses on increasing parental rights in the process of investigating child abuse and neglect. And the debate on the floor and in the committee testimony really centered on parents feeling like they were being burdened in these investigations. And a lot of the conversations were about, is CPS overstepping when they're trying to investigate referrals of child abuse and neglect. And this is not what we heard from the youth. So downstairs, the youth were literally saying, foster care saved my life, at the same time that the conversations were going on upstairs. we had youth talking about how important foster care was. There were no statements of let's do away with the system or the referral process didn't work. They were commenting about. I'm so glad that somebody called and that I received the help that I received. And there was one story in particular, one young man who shared about how he came into foster care as a high schooler and as a teenager, and he explained how he didn't have great family support, so some substance use, mental illness, and he was on his own and not doing well at all. And it wasn't until he went to live with a foster care family that provided him a stable and supportive house that he realized his potential. He was able to get help to cope, to heal, and then to go on. He's now 18, to have a job, be in school. And what he said and told the committee was one of his biggest signs of achievement was when he got the phone call to come and tell his story to the legislators, and that he was heard, and that he might be part of helping other kids have an even better experience in foster care.
That wasn't the only bill that was being debated. There was also a child marriage bill that was voted on immediately before that CPS bill. And Betsy, that failed.
It did. It was voted down, and Idaho has one of the highest child marriage rates in the country. I think many people were surprised that that bill was killed in the House. It would have set a minimum marriage age in Idaho of 16. And currently, under Idaho law, the sponsor of the bill, Representative Melissa Wintrow from Boise, said a 60-year-old could marry a 12-year-old in Idaho. Now, a judge would have to sign off, but the child doesn't have to give consent. And that is the law that we have now.
So again, the parents can give consent and a judge can sign off on it, but the child wouldn't necessarily have a say.
Basically, the proponents of the bill said the law that we have now actually allows institutionalized child abuse through forced marriage of children that parents are complicit in. And the members of the House who objected to this just weren't buying it. Basically, I think they had the same attitude that they did on the child protection bill, that no parent would ever not have their child's best interest at heart, and so we should trust the parents.
So when should we not trust the parents? I mean, when don't I know best on how to take care of my own child?
There's an opportunity to bring all of the voices at the table. So I'd be really curious to ask, a 13-year-old, what do you think about getting married illegally right now? And I think, in the committee hearing, we did hear some of those voices, and it passed out of committee. But then once it hit the floor, we just, there wasn't, nobody stopped to listen, to talk to those who were impacted, and really. What we heard from were kind of the side of the parents, and no checking in with the kids.
Sure. Well, I wanted to switch gears a little bit. There was some big news that broke late Thursday night and Friday morning that we touched on earlier in the show with Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin, and photos of her that appeared on social media posing with 3%ers. She put out a statement on Friday afternoon where she acknowledged that she had posted the photos and immediately took them down when she realized that it was causing controversy, but there was no apology in that statement, was there, Betsy?
No, but I thought there was a fairly strong statement saying that she opposes bigotry and discrimination, and she was basically being a little bit defensive in saying, people are saying, essentially I did something racist and I didn't. And that certainly was never my intent. And I think that in talking with other members of the Senate, of course the Lieutenant Governor is the President of the Senate, there was a lot of talk about this in the Senate today. And I spoke with Senator Cherie Buckner Webb, who of course is the only African American member of the Idaho legislature, and she was deeply concerned about this post. She said that last night her phone basically was on fire. People were calling her from all over the state, essentially under the impression that our state government was endorsing white supremacy or something like that they were afraid to send their kids to the Capitol on their field trips. And she was sure that was not the intent, but very, very concerned about the impact. And she was trying to meet with Lieutenant Governor McGeachin, and I don't know by now whether the two of them have spoken. There were a lot of thoughtful comments, I thought, from senators today about being concerned about how the Senate's perceived, how the Capitol is perceived, how messages are taken, and I thought some of that was reflected in Janice McGeachin's statement as well.
But at the same time, that statement has a couple of phrases that are really, I think, designed to appeal to McGeachin's base, even in the face of this controversy. I mean, she begins her statement by saying that she believes that Todd Engel was treated unjustly by the court system. And she then goes on to suggest that this whole controversy is, quote, part of a larger narrative to paint conservative leaders as embracing identity politics. So I think that there are definitely some signals that she is trying to send to her base, even as this controversy unfolded on Friday.
And when her statement at long last was released, after she'd essentially been hiding from everyone behind locked doors all day, as the media followed her around saying, are you going to say something about what you did here? It was Representative Judy Boyle who went into her office, then came out with the statement and kind of spoke for her. And Representative Boyle said that she saw absolutely nothing wrong with the post and that she herself would not have taken it down. She would have left it up.
Well, you touched on something earlier, Betsy, about intent versus impact, and clearly this has had an impact, especially with many of the Democratic senators. We just got a statement from Senator Marianne Jordan, who said that she had hoped that this incident would provoke a deeper dialogue, but, quote, clearly the dismissal of these concerns tells us all we need to know. Stephen, I wanted to bring you in on the conversation about this isn't the only, she's not the only politician who has been accused of doing something racist or offensive in the last couple of weeks even. I mean, this is becoming a more and more common theme. What can we take from the art of the response,
right,
the art of the apology?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think first of all, when you look at something as powerful symbolically as a picture like that, I think it takes a pretty strong, firm statement of contrition to say, I did something wrong, this was unfortunate, I didn't mean to lead to the kind of interpretations that there were. Instead, what I see is a very fixed, very apparent picture. And then a statement that comes out in a letter that's really hard to actually understand exactly what she's saying, but doesn't sound exactly like an apology. It sounds more like a defensive posture. And I think that does a lot of damage, both in terms of I think the state overall. I mean, I think the sad fact is that a lot of people outside of Idaho don't know a lot about Idaho. There are stereotypes out there, and when you see these sorts of things that go viral, it reinforces a negative image. And I think that doesn't do any justice to all the important progressive and good things that are happening in the state.
Well, and even without the hand gestures, you still have the lieutenant governor one heartbeat away from the governor's office, publicly aligning herself with an anti-government militia group and publicly supporting somebody who is a convicted felon for his role in the Bundy standoff. What message does that send about Idaho?
I mean, the facts speak for themselves. It's really hard to get around exactly what you mentioned. I mean, all these details lead you to a certain conclusion. I think you'd have to rebut that pretty firmly and pretty publicly to sort of get people to say, wait a second, well, this may not be exactly what it seems. But I think right now it's one of these sort of festering crises that's metastasizing, becoming bigger and bigger, and that's unfortunate. It really is.
I think, too, it's going to be interesting to see Governor Little's response to this in the hours and days to come. I mean, Governor Little is 2 months into his term. This is really the first public relations crisis of this kind of magnitude that the party of Brad Little has had to face since he was sworn in, and he is now, the spokesman, the figurehead, if you will, for the Republican Party in Idaho. So his response to this, it's going to be very interesting to see how he kind of walks the line on this and what sort of position he winds up taking.
This, of course, capped off a big news week, but other things happened in D.C. With U.S. Senator Jim Risch, chairman of the Foreign Policy Committee. What did you take away from his Wednesday hearing?
Yeah, well, I guess one of the unfortunate things was that it happened to coincide with the Michael Cohen hearing in the House, so most people sort of overlook that for the bigger spectacle. But there were sort of three issues that were touched upon: Middle East, Russia, and China. And there were some interesting things that came out of those. I think one of the sort of semi-bombshells that surprised people was Senator Risch's comments when it came to Russia, essentially saying that the threat from Russia is overstated. And that's really eye-opening because it flies in the face of what our intelligence agencies themselves have said when it comes to the threat to Russia. It flies in the face of the evidence when it comes to involvement in the 2016 elections. But
it aligns with President Trump and his position.
It does and it doesn't. It does align with some of the tweets and rhetoric that Trump has said, but when it comes to actually what Trump's government, what the intelligence agencies, what the Department of Defense, what the State Department are saying and doing in terms of sanctions, they're not saying that Russia isn't a threat. They are sanctioning Russia very hard. They're messaging a different line. So it really points to a disconnect and I guess an alignment with Senator Risch continually with President Trump over the bureaucracy and everyone else when it comes to Russia.
But he sees China as a big threat.
Right. He sees China as a big threat, and it's sort of interesting because there's new developments happening right now. There's a sign that potentially there may be a deal in the offing, and that I think President Trump decided not to go ahead and add $200 billion in additional tariffs on China. So that's, I think, a good thing in terms of trying to get to a resolution. But I think on this issue, Senator Risch has been pretty strong and really in the corner of Micron in particular in terms of saying, don't steal our proprietary information, don't let China take advanced technology. And I think that is something that a lot of people are concerned about. So I think on that issue, Senator Risch is in a decent place. Then, of course, there's the Middle East as well, which was talked about. And I think here as well, Senator Risch has been doing some interesting things, including sponsoring a bill that really says that holding the Syrian government accountable for atrocities and making sure that you don't leave a place in a complete mess is an important thing. And that actually runs against what President Trump has said in terms of messaging that we're going to depart Syria right away, that the fight against ISIS is concluded, even though most of his government says that's not true. And most of our allies say, hold on a second, this fight is not done yet. So some differences, subtly.
When it comes to what Senator Risch thinks, though, how much does it really matter, especially when you consider that the House is controlled by another party and President Trump is going to do what President Trump is going to do, as we saw this week with North Korea?
Right. Well, I think rhetorically and symbolically, Senator Risch, if he chose to spoke up and break with the president on some of the big issues, I think that would mean a lot. Everything Senator Risch has said has been that he's not going to take that direction, that he doesn't want to publicly air disputes with the president. And so North Korea is a good case in point, where we sort of saw a kind of slow motion disaster take place, where essentially 90% of all the issues with North Korea had yet to be figured out and negotiated, and then you sent two heads of state in, and of course the whole thing fell apart. Now, I think the prudent thing would be to say, this is not how you negotiate. Set up a deal so you can actually get a negotiation and a settlement that makes sense, instead of going in sort of blind and then being surprised when everything kind of falls apart and walking away from something. And now you got to ask yourself, what happens next?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen next in D.C., but I do know that next week we are going to see a Medicaid sideboard bill, most likely in House Health and Welfare. Betsy, we have about a minute left. Can you tell us what to expect?
The committee chairman, Fred Wood, said that his committee will consider introducing a bill from Representative John Vanderwoude on Monday. I did speak with Representative Vanderwoude. He said some of the details of that bill still were being worked out just now today. And so there will definitely be some kind of sideboard proposals, for sure, including some kind of conditional sunset, that if the 90-10 split for federal funding for Medicaid expansion were to change, that our program would go away, but also many other and perhaps much more controversial items to be added.
Any idea what some of those controversial items might be? I've heard things about an enrollment period and SNAP work requirements.
I think the most controversial proposal is for work requirements. Other states have had significant problems trying to enforce those, and that may well be in the bill that's proposed on Monday. We'll see.
Any indication where the rest of the House Republican caucus stands?
My sense is that the House Republican caucus wants some kind of sideboards, but there are a lot of them out there. And JFAC has already unanimously approved the funding.
And I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.